Welcome to Maplewood Grove, where life looks perfect on the outside, but for Derek and Alyssa Harris, their move here reveals unexpected challenges. A seemingly perfect neighborhood turns hostile when their presence disrupts an old order. With their two children, Samantha and Ethan, the Harris family faces threats, exclusion, and acts of vandalism. But instead of running, they stand on their ground. How far would you go to protect your home, your family, and your right to belong? In a dramatic turn, Derek discovers a powerful secret that shifts the balance of power and challenges the community to confront its own prejudices. Will the Harrises finally be accepted, or will they continue to fight for their place in the neighborhood? You won't want to miss the twists and turns that lead to an unexpected resolution. This is a story about family, courage, and the resilience it takes to transform a community from division to unity. The sun was setting over Maplewood Grove, casting a warm, golden hue across the carefully manicured lawns and picturesque homes of the suburban neighborhood. It was a place where the streets were lined with tidy rows of trees, and the residents prided themselves on maintaining appearances. It was the kind of place that offered peace and security, everything the Harris family had hoped for when they decided to move in. Derek Harris stood on the front porch of his new home, surveying the quiet neighborhood. At 45, Derek was a man of confidence, with sharp features and a presence that exuded calm authority. His wife, Alyssa, joined him, brushing a strand of hair away from her face as she smiled. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Alyssa said. Her eyes were taking in the serene street. Derek agreed, though his smile was tempered. "It's perfect." Behind them, the sounds of their children filled the air. 16-year-old Samantha and 10-year-old Ethan were running around the front yard, excitedly exploring their new surroundings. Samantha, who had just started to come into her own as a teenager, was already planning how to decorate her new room. Ethan, meanwhile, was full of energy and curiosity, as always, darting around like he couldn't take it all in fast enough. "It feels like a fresh start," Alyssa said, leaning into Derek. "That's the plan," Derek replied, wrapping an arm around her. "A place where the kids can grow up safe, good schools, a sense of community." As they stood there, soaking in the moment, Derek's attention was drawn to a group of neighbors gathered across the street. He offered a friendly wave, but only one person, a tall man with gray hair, returned the gesture a half-hearted nod before turning back to the group. Alyssa followed Derek's gaze. "They're watching us like we're some kind of spectacle," she commented, her smile fading slightly. "Maybe they just need time to adjust to new faces," Derek said, though he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his gut. The family continued settling into their home over the next few days. Moving boxes were unpacked, furniture was arranged, and life seemed to slowly settle into a new routine. But the unease that Derek and Alyssa had sensed on that first day lingered. Neighbors walked by, casting curious glances their way. Conversations would stop abruptly as they approached, and smiles that had once seemed so abundant were nowhere to be found. Despite Derek's best efforts to greet them, the responses were cold at best, non-existent at worst. It didn't take long for the children to notice. Samantha, always observant, was the first to mention it. "Dad, why do the neighbors act so weird around us?" she asked one evening as they sat down to dinner. Derek exchanged a glance with Alyssa before answering. "People just need time, Sam. We're new here. They're not used to us yet." Samantha didn't look convinced, but she let it go for the time being. Ethan, however, remained blissfully unaware. His attention focused on his food and whatever game he planned to play after dinner. Later that night, as Derek and Alyssa sat together in the living room, they talked about the subtle coldness they'd encountered. "They've been polite enough," Alyssa said, her voice uncertain. "But there's something off." Derek nodded. "Yeah, I've noticed it too. We're outsiders. They barely talk to us. And have you noticed that we haven't been invited to any neighborhood events? I saw them having a barbecue down the street yesterday. No one even mentioned it to us." Derek sighed. "It's early. Let's give it some time." Alyssa wasn't as convinced, but she trusted Derek's judgment. "I just hope it doesn't affect the kids too much." But it wasn't long before the children started feeling the strain of their new environment. Samantha came home from school one day looking upset. When Alyssa asked her what was wrong, Samantha hesitated before answering. "Some of the kids at school, they were acting weird," she said quietly. "One of them told me that her parents don't think we should be living here." Alyssa's heart sank. She had hoped that the unwelcoming attitudes would remain confined to adults. But it seemed that prejudice was seeping into the younger generation as well. "What did you say?" Alyssa asked gently. Samantha shrugged. "I didn't say anything. I just walked away." Alyssa felt a surge of protective anger, but forced herself to stay calm. "You did the right thing. You don't need to engage with people like that." Samantha nodded, but Alyssa could see the hurt in her daughter's eyes. It wasn't easy for a 16-year-old to feel like an outsider, especially in a place that was supposed to be a fresh start. Meanwhile, Ethan had his own encounters with the neighborhood kids. Though younger and more naive, he was starting to notice the shift in how his peers treated him. The children he used to play with seemed more distant now, some even avoiding him entirely. One afternoon, as Derek was heading out to run errands, he noticed a small group of kids playing down the street. Ethan was sitting on the porch, watching them with a look of confusion on his face. "What's up, champ?" Derek asked, ruffling Ethan's hair. "Why don't they want to play with me anymore?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with sadness. Derek's heart ached for his son. "Sometimes people need time to get to know you," he said, hoping that would be enough to satisfy Ethan for now. But Derek knew the truth. It wasn't about getting to know them. It was about something deeper, something that had been simmering beneath the surface since the day they moved in. As the days turned into weeks, the Harris family found themselves increasingly isolated. The small acts of coldness became more noticeable, and the sense of community they had hoped for seemed out of reach. Derek remained optimistic, trying to brush off the negativity, but Alyssa grew more and more uneasy. Then one evening, as the family was preparing for dinner, there was a knock at the door. Alyssa answered it to find a man in his early 60s standing on the porch. He was stout, with graying hair and a stern expression. "Good evening," he said, though his tone was anything but warm. "I'm Bill Anderson. I live just down the street. Thought I'd come by and introduce myself." Alyssa forced a smile, hoping to diffuse the tension she felt. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Anderson. I'm Alyssa, and this is my husband, Derek." Derek joined them at the door, extending a hand in greeting. Bill shook it, but there was a critical glint in his eye as he sized Derek up. "So, what brings you to Maplewood Grove?" Bill asked, as if the Harris family's presence required some sort of explanation. "We've been looking for a neighborhood like this for a while," Derek said, keeping his tone neutral. "Good schools, safe streets, strong sense of community." Bill nodded slowly, but didn't seem entirely convinced. "Well, we've been here for a long time. We like to keep things consistent." The unspoken message hung in the air. The Harris family represented a disruption to that consistency. Alyssa sensed the tension and tried to smooth things over. "We're really looking forward to being part of the community." Bill's eyes flickered toward Derek before he nodded again, this time more curtly. "I hope everything works out for you." With that, he turned and left, leaving Derek and Alyssa standing in the doorway, feeling the weight of his disapproval. "That was uncomfortable," Alyssa said, closing the door behind her. Derek agreed, his jaw tight. "But we're not going anywhere." As the days passed, the Harris family's hopes for a peaceful new life in Maplewood Grove started to feel more like a distant dream. The subtle acts of hostility they had experienced since their arrival grew more frequent and harder to ignore. One Saturday morning, as Alyssa was unpacking a few more boxes in the kitchen, she glanced out the window and noticed a neighborhood barbecue taking place just a few houses down. There were colorful decorations strung across the backyard, and the smell of grilled burgers and hot dogs filled the air. Dozens of neighbors mingled, laughing and chatting, while children played on the lawn. "We didn't get an invite," Alyssa muttered to herself, feeling the sting of exclusion. Derek walked into the kitchen, catching her gaze. "Another party we weren't invited to?" Alyssa nodded, her frustration simmering beneath the surface. "It's like they're purposely leaving us out." Every time there's a gathering, we're the only ones not included. Derek sighed, leaning against the counter. I know. I've noticed it too. But I don't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe they just forgot this time. They haven't forgotten, Alyssa said, shaking her head. This is intentional. They don't want us here. Despite Derek's attempts to remain optimistic, Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that their neighbors were actively excluding them, and she was right. The following week, the tension took on a more personal tone when Samantha came home from school looking upset. She had been dealing with subtle coldness from some of her classmates since they moved, but today was different. "What's wrong, honey?" Alyssa asked as Samantha dropped her backpack on the floor and slumped into a chair at the dining table. Samantha hesitated for a moment before answering. "Some kids at school, they're saying things." "What kind of things?" Derek asked, joining the conversation. Samantha fiddled with the edge of her shirt, avoiding eye contact. "They said their parents don't think we should be living here. They were whispering about us, calling us names." Alyssa's heart clenched as she listened to her daughter. "What kind of names?" Samantha's voice dropped to a near whisper. "They called us outsiders and other things. I don't want to repeat it." Derek's jaw tightened. "Did you say anything back?" Samantha shook her head. "I just ignored them." "You did the right thing," Alyssa said softly, reaching out to squeeze Samantha's hand. "But it's not fair. You shouldn't have to deal with that." "It's okay, Mom," Samantha said, though the pain in her eyes told a different story. "I'm used to it." Alyssa's heart broke for her daughter, but before she could say more, Ethan came bounding into the house, his usual energy dimmed. He tossed his backpack onto the floor and sat down across from Samantha, his face clouded with confusion. "What's wrong, Ethan?" Derek asked, noticing the change in his son's demeanor. "Some of the kids in the neighborhood won't play with me anymore," Ethan said, his voice quiet. "I tried to ask them to come play basketball, but they said their parents don't want them hanging out with me." Derek felt a surge of anger at the thought of his children being ostracized. "Did they say why?" Ethan shrugged, his eyes downcast. "They didn't really say, just that their parents don't like us." Alyssa and Derek exchanged a glance, their unspoken fears now confirmed. It wasn't just the adults who were harboring prejudice, it had trickled down to their children as well. "We haven't done anything wrong," Ethan said, looking up at his parents with wide, innocent eyes. "Why don't they like us?" Alyssa knelt down next to Ethan, brushing his curls back from his forehead. "Sometimes people judge others before they get to know them. It's not right, but we can't let it change who we are. We have to be strong together." Ethan nodded, though the sadness in his eyes didn't fade. As the days passed, the subtle signs of discomfort from the neighbors continued. The Harris family noticed that when they walked down the street, conversations would stop abruptly, and the friendly smiles that seemed so abundant for everyone else were withheld from them. They received no invitations to the neighborhood barbecues or gatherings that seemed to happen almost weekly. One evening, Samantha came home from school and was particularly upset. She sat down at the dining table with a huff, crossing her arms over her chest. "What happened?" Alyssa asked, sitting across from her daughter. "Mom, the kids at school are acting even weirder," Samantha said, her frustration evident. "Some of them wouldn't even sit with me at lunch today, and one girl said her parents think we don't belong here." Derek, who had been listening from the kitchen, walked over and sat down next to Samantha. His jaw was tight, but he kept his voice calm. "We knew there might be some challenges, Sam. But remember, we belong here just as much as anyone else." Samantha didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway. "I just don't get it. We haven't done anything wrong." Ethan, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it, piped up. "Why don't they like us, Dad? We haven't done anything bad." Alyssa knelt down next to Ethan again, repeating the words she had said before. "Sometimes people make judgments about others without really knowing them. It's not fair, but we can't let it change who we are." Later that evening, as the family sat down for dinner, they found an envelope slipped under their front door. Alyssa noticed it first and called Derek out. "There's something here," she said, picking up the envelope and handing it to him. Derek opened the envelope, his expression hardening as he read the contents. Inside was a typed note, unsigned. "You don't belong here. Leave now before it's too late." Alyssa's eyes widened as she read over Derek's shoulder. "This isn't just about being unfriendly," she said, her voice laced with concern. "This is a threat." Derek folded the note and set it aside, his expression determined. "We're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "They don't know who they're dealing with." The days following the anonymous threat were tense. Derek and Alyssa decided to keep the note a secret from the children, not wanting to scare them. But the message weighed heavily on their minds, and as the Harris family went about their daily routines, the undercurrent of hostility in the neighborhood became more pronounced. One morning, as Derek was heading out for work, he noticed something off about his car. The tires were deflated, and upon closer inspection, he saw long, deep scratches running along the sides of the vehicle. He clenched his fists in anger, but took a deep breath to steady himself. Reporting this to the police would likely do little, and Derek knew that reacting impulsively could escalate the situation. When he told Alyssa what had happened, she wasn't surprised. "They're trying to push us out," she said, her voice filled with frustration. "But they're going to find out we're not so easily intimidated." "That's right," Derek agreed, though he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "They've crossed a line, but we need to be smart about how we handle this." Later that day, Alyssa decided to reach out to the local homeowners association. She wanted to make sure they were aware of harassment and to gauge their reaction. When she called, she was met with an icy receptionist. "We'll look into it," the association president, Thomas Bell, said curtly. "But I have to tell you, we've never had any issues like this in the past. Maybe you're just misinterpreting things." "Misinterpreting?" Alyssa repeated, incredulous. "Someone vandalized our car and sent us a threatening note. How am I supposed to interpret that?" "Look, Mrs. Harris," Thomas replied, clearly eager to end the conversation, "I'll see what I can do, but my advice is to keep a low profile. Things tend to work themselves out if you don't stir the pot." Alyssa hung up, feeling more isolated than ever. It was clear that they were on their own, but rather than feeling defeated, she felt a surge of determination. "If they think we're going to back down, they're wrong," Alyssa muttered to herself. Meanwhile, Derek began making discreet inquiries into the history of the neighborhood. He knew that understanding the dynamics at play could give them an advantage. He spent hours combing through property records, learning about the ownership and development of the area. It wasn't long before Derek started to notice a pattern. Many of the houses in the neighborhood were owned by a single real estate company, one that had deep ties to the community and a long history of discriminatory practices. Armed with this knowledge, Derek began formulating a plan. He didn't want to simply defend his family. He wanted to turn the tables on those who sought to harm them. The tipping point came one evening when the Harris family returned home from a rare night out. As they pulled into the driveway, they were met with a shocking sight. Their front lawn was littered with garbage, rotten food, broken glass, and old newspapers scattered across the grass. And spray-painted in bold red letters across the garage door were the words, "Get out." Alyssa gasped, covering her mouth with her hand as she took in the scene. Derek, standing beside her, felt a cold fury rise within him. This was no longer just about making a stand. It was about showing these people that their actions had consequences. "We're not just going to sit here and take this," Derek said, his voice firm. "It's time we fight back." That night, after cleaning up the mess, Derek gathered his family around the dining table. He shared with them what he had discovered about the ownership of the neighborhood, the people who had orchestrated their harassment and their own power to change the situation. "We own this house," Derek began, his voice calm but resolute. "But what you don't know is that we own more than that. We own this entire block. Every house that's been giving us trouble belongs to us." Samantha and Ethan looked at their father in surprise. "How?" Samantha asked, trying to process what this meant. "I've been investing in real estate for years," Derek explained, "and I knew when we moved here that this neighborhood had potential. What I didn't know was that the people living here would try to drive us out. But now that I do, We're going to use our position to put an end to this." Alyssa looked at her husband with a mixture of pride and concern. "What are you planning?" "I'm going to confront them at the next neighborhood meeting," Derek said. "I'll present the facts. They've been paying rent to us without even knowing it. They want to evict us, but they have no idea that they're trying to evict their own landlords." The family sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the situation. Then, one by one, they nodded in agreement. They would face this challenge together, and they would not be intimidated. The night of the neighborhood meeting arrived, and Derek was more than ready. He had spent the last several days gathering documents, making sure every detail of his plan was ironclad. Alyssa offered to come with him, but Derek insisted on going alone. He didn't want to put her in a potentially volatile situation, and besides, this was his battle to fight. "I'll be fine," he reassured her as he kissed her on the cheek. "I've got everything I need." Alyssa nodded, though Derek could see the worry in her eyes. "Just be careful," she said. "These people don't exactly play fair." Derek gave her a small smile. "I know, but they don't know who they're dealing with." As Derek walked into the community center that evening, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The usual pleasantries of neighborhood meetings were absent, replaced by stiff silence and suspicious glances. Derek could feel the weight of every eye on him as he entered, but he refused to be daunted. He had a purpose, and nothing was going to stand in his way. At the front of the room, Bill Anderson, who seemed to have taken on the unofficial role of leader among the neighbors, stood shuffling papers. He glanced up as Derek approached, giving him a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Harris," Bill said, his voice clipped. "Glad you could join us tonight." Derek nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson. I understand there are some concerns about our presence here, and I thought it was time we addressed them directly." A murmur rippled through the room as some of the neighbors exchanged knowing looks. Bill cleared his throat and gestured for Derek to take a seat, but Derek remained standing. He wasn't here to sit down and be talked at. He was here to take control of the narrative. "I can see there's a lot of tension in the room tonight," Derek began, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like to address that tension head on. Since my family and I moved here, it's become increasingly clear that not everyone is happy with our presence. We've received threats, had our property vandalized, and been subjected to a level of hostility that's both unwarranted and unacceptable." The room fell silent. Derek could see the discomfort on many of the neighbors' faces, but he pressed on. "I want to make it very clear that my family is here to stay. We have every right to be here, just as much as anyone else in this room. But what some of you may not realize is that our ties to this neighborhood go much deeper than just our home." Derek reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, placing them on the table in front of him. "These are the property records for every house on this block," he said, his voice steady. "And as it turns out, they all have something in common. They're owned by the same entity. That entity happens to be a real estate company that I've built over the years." There was an audible gasp from around the room, and Derek could see the shift in their expressions: shock, disbelief, and in some cases, fear. Bill Anderson's face drained of color, but he quickly composed himself, trying to regain control of the situation. "I don't see how this is relevant, Mr. Harris," Bill said, his voice rising slightly. "We're here to discuss community matters, not your business ventures." "Oh, but it's very relevant," Derek replied, his gaze locking onto Bill's. "Because it seems that while some of you were busy trying to make my family feel unwelcome, you were unaware that you were trying to evict your own landlord." Stunned silence followed Derek's words as the realization began to dawn on the neighbors. Derek could see the smug superiority draining from their faces, replaced by uncertainty and, in some cases, panic. Bill, however, wasn't ready to give up so easily. "This changes nothing," he said, his voice growing more agitated. "Just because you own the property doesn't mean you can dictate how we live our lives. We have standards here, Mr. Harris, and some of us aren't willing to lower them." Derek met Bill's gaze steadily. I'm not asking anyone to lower their standards. I'm asking for fairness, for decency. If you can't offer that, then maybe it's you who needs to reconsider where you live." The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment it seemed as though things might spiral out of control. But then one woman, Nancy Parker, who had earlier been part of the group watching the Harrises move in, raised her hand hesitantly. "Mr. Harris," Nancy began, her voice shaking slightly. "We had no idea. I don't agree with how things have been handled. Maybe we could start over." Derek gave her a small nod. "I'm open to that, Mrs. Parker, but it has to be genuine. My family and I deserve the same respect and consideration as anyone else here." There were murmurs of agreement from a few others in the room, but Derek could still sense the underlying tension. Bill Anderson, however, was not ready to back down. "This changes nothing," Bill said, his voice rising as he tried to rally the others. "We have a right to keep our community the way we want it. Just because you own property here doesn't mean we have to accept your family." Derek's expression hardened. "I'm not asking for special treatment, Mr. Anderson. I'm asking for basic human decency. If you can't offer that, then you're the one with the problem, not us." The room was electric with tension, and for a moment it seemed as though things might boil over. But then another neighbor, Margaret Johnson, stood up. Margaret had been one of the most vocal opponents of the Harris family when they first moved in, but now she looked at Derek with a mixture of regret and humility. "I was wrong," Margaret said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I let myself get caught up in the negativity, and I regret it. The Harris family has done nothing wrong, and they deserve to be treated with the same respect as anyone else here." Her words hung in the air, and slowly others began to murmur their agreement. Derek could see the tide beginning to turn, but he knew that not everyone would come around. Bill Anderson, seeing his support wane, tightened his lips and sat down, glaring at Derek but saying nothing more. Derek took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders began to ease. He had won this round, but he knew there was still work to be done. "Thank you," Derek said, his voice steady. "Let's work together to make this neighborhood a place where everyone feels welcome. That's all my family has ever wanted." With that, the meeting slowly began to break up. Some neighbors approached Derek to apologize, while others left quickly, avoiding eye contact. As Derek gathered his things, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Nancy Parker, who gave him a small, sincere smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Harris," she said quietly. Derek smiled back, feeling a sense of cautious optimism. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker. I appreciate that." As Derek walked out of the community center that night, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The battle wasn't over, but tonight, he had made it clear that the Harris family was here to stay, and that they were not to be underestimated. The days following the community meeting brought a noticeable shift in the neighborhood. The open hostility that had once greeted the Harris family at every turn began to fade, replaced by an uneasy silence. Some neighbors, like Nancy Parker and Margaret Johnson, made genuine efforts to reach out, offering apologies and tentative gestures of friendship. Others, like Bill Anderson, remained cold and distant, clearly resentful of the new power dynamics. Despite the changing atmosphere, Derek knew that the battle was far from over. He had made his stand, but he also understood that deeply ingrained prejudices and resentment wouldn't disappear overnight. The Harrises continued to go about their lives with dignity and determination, refusing to let the lingering tension affect their day-to-day activities. One afternoon, Derek was working in his home office when his phone buzzed. It was a text message from Alyssa, who had just returned from a meeting with a client. "We need to talk." Derek immediately felt a pang of concern. Alyssa was not one to send ominous messages lightly. When Alyssa arrived home, Derek could see the worry etched on her face. She set her briefcase down and sat across from him at the kitchen table. "I had a very interesting conversation with Thomas Bell today," Alyssa began, referring to the president of the Homeowners Association. Derek leaned forward, his attention fully on her. "What happened?" "He pulled me aside after my meeting to discuss some concerns the association still has about us." Alyssa said, her voice steady but filled with frustration. He mentioned that some of the members are planning to file a formal complaint against us, claiming that we're causing unrest in the neighborhood. Derek's jaw tightened. Unrest? They're the ones who've been harassing us. Alyssa sighed, running a hand through her hair. They're trying to paint us as the problem, Derek, as if we're the ones stirring up trouble. Derek felt a surge of anger, but quickly tamped it down. This is just another attempt to push us out, he said, his voice calm but firm. But we're not going anywhere. Exactly, Alyssa agreed. We need to get ahead of this. If they want to file a complaint, we need to be ready to fight back. Derek nodded in agreement. We'll need to gather evidence. Document everything that's happened. If they want to play dirty, we'll be ready and we'll make sure the truth is on our side. Over the next few days, Derek and Alyssa worked tirelessly to gather evidence of the harassment they had endured. They compiled photographs of vandalism, saved copies of the threatening notes, and documented every interaction that could be considered hostile. Derek also reached out to some of the more sympathetic neighbors, like Nancy Parker and Margaret Johnson, asking if they would be willing to speak up on their behalf, if it came to that. The days after the neighborhood meeting were filled with a tense quiet. While the open hostility from some of the neighbors had been subdued, it was clear that not everyone was ready to accept the Harris family's place in Maplewood Grove. Derek and Alyssa remained on alert, knowing that their struggle wasn't over. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Samantha seemed unusually quiet. Alyssa noticed right away and placed her hand on her daughter's arm. "Honey, what's on your mind?" she asked. Samantha hesitated, glancing up at Derek before speaking. "Some of the kids at school are still acting weird," she said quietly. "They don't say anything directly, but I can feel it. They talk behind my back and I can tell they think we don't belong here." Derek exchanged a glance with Alyssa, his heart sinking. They had hoped that the tension would ease over time, but it seemed that their children were still feeling the weight of the neighborhood's animosity. "I know it's hard, Sam," Derek said, his voice gentle. "But remember, you belong here just as much as anyone else." Samantha nodded, though she didn't seem convinced. "It just feels like no matter what we do, they'll never accept us." Alyssa reached out and squeezed her daughter's hand. "It takes time, sweetie. People can be slow to change, but we're strong, and we're not going anywhere." Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, Derek and Alyssa sat in the living room, discussing the growing unease in the neighborhood. "We've done everything we can to show them that we're part of this community," Alyssa said, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "But it feels like they're just waiting for us to slip up. They're looking for any reason to push us out." Derek nodded, his expression somber. "That's exactly what they're doing, and with Thomas Bell and the Homeowners Association backing them, they think they can pressure us into leaving. They don't know us very well, do they?" Alyssa said with a bitter laugh. "We're not going anywhere." "No, we're not," Derek agreed, his voice firm. "But we need to be smart about this. They're trying to paint us as the problem. We need to be prepared." In the days that followed, Derek and Alyssa focused on gathering evidence. They took photographs of the vandalism in their car, saved copies of the threatening notes, and kept a detailed record of every hostile interaction they had experienced. Derek also reached out to their more sympathetic neighbors, like Nancy Parker and Margaret Johnson, hoping to rally support in case the situation escalated further. One afternoon, while Derek was reviewing the documentation they had compiled, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Nancy Parker. "I've heard some of the neighbors are still planning to file that complaint with the Homeowners Association. They're not backing down." Derek felt a surge of anger, but quickly composed himself. He knew that reacting impulsively would only play into their hands. "Thanks for the heads up, Nancy. We're prepared." As Derek put down his phone, Alyssa walked into the room, noticing the look on his face. "Bad news?" she asked. "Some of the neighbors are still planning to file that complaint," Derek said, rubbing his temples. "They're not going to let this go." Alyssa sat down next to him, her expression resolute. "We need to get ahead of this. If they file that complaint, we need to be ready with everything we've gathered. And if it comes to it, we'll take legal action." Derek nodded, his determination growing. "We've been documenting everything, They won't have a leg to stand on, but we need to be careful. If they want to drag us into a fight, we need to make sure we're prepared for anything." Meanwhile, Samantha and Ethan were dealing with their own challenges at school. While Samantha had always been more reserved, Ethan had always been a more outgoing child. But he was even starting to feel the strain of being excluded by the other neighborhood kids. One afternoon, as Ethan was playing basketball in the driveway, he noticed a group of kids from the neighborhood approaching. Among them was Ryan Collins, one of the boys who had been particularly cold towards him since the Harris family had moved in. Ryan smirked as he approached, tossing a basketball from hand to hand. "You still playing alone, Harris? Where's your team?" Ethan squared his shoulders, refusing to let Ryan's taunts get under his skin. "I don't need a team to beat you, Ryan. Want to play one-on-one?" Ryan's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "You're on." The game started, and Ethan poured all of his frustration and anger into it. He outmaneuvered Ryan at every turn, his skills honed from years of playing with his dad and sister. By the time the game ended, Ethan had won by a wide margin. Ryan, clearly embarrassed, tried to laugh it off. "You got lucky, Harris." Ethan wiped the sweat from his forehead, his heart still pounding from the game. "Good game," he said, extending a hand in a show of sportsmanship. But Ryan wasn't interested in making peace. He scowled, muttering under his breath before turning and walking away, his friends following him. As Ethan watched them go, he felt a mix of triumph and sadness. He had proven himself on the court, but deep down, he knew that some of the kids in the neighborhood would never accept him, no matter what he did. Back at home, Ethan shared the story with his parents and sister. While Derek was proud of his son for standing up for himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that the tension in the neighborhood was only going to escalate. "They'll come around," Derek said, trying to reassure his son. "It might take time, but they'll see you for who you really are." "I'm not sure they will, Dad," Ethan said quietly, his confidence shaken. "Some of them just don't like us." Derek felt a pang of guilt. He had brought his family to Maplewood Grove believing it would be a fresh start, but now it seemed like it had only brought them more challenges. The next major challenge came when Derek received a formal notice from the Homeowners Association. The neighbors who had been leading the charge against the Harris family had officially filed a complaint claiming that the Harrises were disrupting the peace and causing unrest in the community. Alyssa read the notice over Derek's shoulder, her anger flaring as she reached the end. "This is ridiculous. We're the ones being harassed, and now they're trying to paint us as the problem?" "They're trying to push us out," Derek said, his voice tight. "They think if they make things difficult enough, we'll leave on our own." "Well, they're wrong," Alyssa said firmly. "We're not going anywhere." Derek nodded, his determination growing. "We're going to fight this. We have evidence. We just need to present it in the right way." Over the next few days, Derek and Alyssa worked tirelessly to prepare their response to the Homeowners Association. They compiled all of the evidence they had gathered, photos, notes, records of every hostile interaction, and prepared to present it at the upcoming association meeting. When the night of the meeting arrived, Derek and Alyssa walked into the community center together, their heads held high. They had spent hours preparing for this moment, and they were ready to defend their place in the neighborhood. As they entered the room, Derek could feel the eyes of the neighbors on them. Some looked curious, others hostile, but Derek refused to be intimidated. At the front of the room, Thomas Bell called the meeting to order. "We've received complaints from some members of this community regarding recent disturbances," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "We want to ensure that everyone in this neighborhood feels safe and welcome, but it seems that some feel otherwise." Derek stood up, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "I'd like to address those concerns directly." All eyes turned to him, and Derek could feel the weight of their stares. He took a deep breath and began. "My family and I moved to Maplewood Grove because we believed this was a community where we could build a life, where our children could grow up feeling safe and accepted," Derek said, his voice calm but firm. "But instead, we've been met with hostility, threats, and vandalism. We've documented everything, and we're prepared to take legal action if necessary." Derek reached into his briefcase and pulled out the thick folder of evidence, handing it to Thomas Bell. "These are copies of the police reports, photographs, and notes we've received. I think you'll find that the evidence speaks for itself." Thomas Bell took the folder, flipping through the pages as his expression grew more serious with each passing moment. "As for the complaints about us," Derek continued, his voice unwavering, "they're baseless. We've done nothing to disrupt this community, and we've made every effort to be good neighbors. If anyone here feels otherwise, I'd like to hear why." The room was silent. Derek scanned the faces of the neighbors, challenging them to speak up. Bill Anderson, who had been one of the main instigators, shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. Finally, Nancy Parker stood up. "I was wrong," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I let myself get caught up in the negativity, and I regret it. The Harris family has done nothing wrong, and they deserve to be treated with the same respect as anyone else here." Her words hung in the air, and slowly others began to murmur in agreement. Derek could see the tide beginning to turn. Thomas Bell cleared his throat, clearly realizing that the narrative had shifted. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker, and thank you, Mr. Harris, for bringing this to our attention. We will review this evidence carefully, and I assure you that appropriate actions will be taken." Derek sat down, feeling a sense of relief washed over him. They had faced the worst of it, and now, finally, they were being heard. As the meeting adjourned, several neighbors approached Derek and Alyssa, offering apologies and assurances that they would support them moving forward. Derek accepted their words with grace, but he knew it would take time to rebuild trust. As they left the community center that night, Derek turned to Alyssa and smiled. "We did it," he said quietly. Alyssa squeezed his hand. "We did, but let's not let our guard down just yet. There's still work to be done." Derek nodded, knowing she was right. But for the first time since they had moved in, he felt a glimmer of hope that things might actually start to change. In the weeks following the Homeowners Association meeting, the atmosphere in Maplewood Grove shifted. While some neighbors made small efforts to reconcile, others remained distant, clinging to their resentment toward the Harris family. Derek and Alyssa could sense the unease, the lingering hostility that refused to dissipate entirely. Nancy Parker and Margaret Johnson had extended olive branches, inviting Alyssa to their book club and apologizing for their earlier behavior. But despite these gestures, Derek knew that the tension was far from over. The Harris family might have won the battle, but they hadn't yet won the war. One morning, as Derek was sipping his coffee and reading the newspaper, his phone buzzed with a new text message. It was from Nancy, heard from a reliable source. "Some neighbors are still trying to push the association to take action against you. Bill Anderson's leading the charge." Derek sighed, setting his phone down. It seemed that no matter how much progress they made, Bill Anderson and his allies weren't willing to let go of their grudge. They were determined to push the Harrises out, even if it meant dragging the entire neighborhood into another conflict. When Alyssa came downstairs a few minutes later, she could see the frustration on Derek's face. "What's wrong?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Bill Anderson's still at it," Derek replied, his tone tight. "Nancy says he's trying to rally the neighbors again, pushing the association to take action against us." Alyssa shook her head, her frustration mirroring Derek's. "I don't get it. We've done everything right. We've been nothing but respectful. What more do they want?" "They don't want us here, plain and simple," Derek said. "It's not about what we've done, it's about who we are." Alyssa's expression hardened. "Well, they're not going to win. We're not leaving." Derek nodded in agreement. "No, we're not, but we need to be ready. Bill's not going to stop until he gets what he wants." Meanwhile, Samantha and Ethan were dealing with their own struggles at school. Although the bullying had eased somewhat after Derek's confrontation with the Homeowners Association, the underlying tension remained. Samantha still found herself excluded from certain social circles, and Ethan's relationships with the neighborhood kids remained strained. One afternoon, Samantha came home looking particularly upset. She threw her backpack on the floor and slumped into a chair at the kitchen table, her face flushed with frustration. "What happened?" Alyssa asked, sitting down across from her daughter. "It's the same thing, Mom," Samantha said, her voice tight. The kids at school are still talking behind my back. Some of them are saying we don't belong here, that we're causing trouble. Derek, who had been working from home that day, overheard the conversation and walked into the kitchen. "What are they saying, Sam?" "They're just repeating what their parents say," Samantha replied bitterly. "That we're outsiders, that we're disrupting the neighborhood. No matter what I do, I can't escape it." Alyssa reached out to comfort her daughter, but Samantha pulled away, her frustration boiling over. "I just want to be treated like everyone else. Why is that so hard?" Derek's heart ached for his daughter. He had hoped that by standing up to the neighborhood, they could protect their children from the worst of it. But it seemed that the prejudice was more deeply ingrained than they had realized. "You belong here, Sam," Derek said gently. "Don't ever forget that. No matter what anyone says, you have every right to be here." Samantha sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I know, Dad, but sometimes it feels like no one else believes that." While Samantha struggled to find her place at school, Ethan was dealing with a different challenge. Despite his outgoing nature, he had found himself increasingly isolated from the neighborhood kids. Many of the children who used to play with him had distanced themselves, either because of their parents' influence or because they didn't want to be caught in the middle of the neighborhood's tensions. One afternoon, as Ethan was shooting hoops in the driveway, a group of neighborhood boys approached. Among them was Tim Harris, a boy who had been particularly cold towards Ethan since the Harris family moved in. Tim sneered as he approached, tossing a basketball between his hands. "Still playing alone, Ethan? Thought you'd be used to that by now." Ethan clenched his fists, fighting the urge to snap back. "I don't need a team to beat you, Tim. You want to play one-on-one?" Tim smirked, clearly enjoying the opportunity to taunt Ethan. "You think you can beat me?" Ethan squared his shoulders, his determination rising. "I know I can." The game started, and Ethan poured all of his frustration and anger into every move. He dribbled past Tim with ease, sinking shot after shot while Tim struggled to keep up. By the time the game ended, Ethan had won by a wide margin. Tim, clearly embarrassed, tried to play it off. "You got lucky," he muttered. Ethan wiped the sweat from his forehead, his heart still pounding from the game. "Good game," he said, offering a hand in sportsmanship. But Tim wasn't interested in making peace. He scowled, muttering something under his breath before turning and walking away, his friends following him. As Ethan watched them go, he felt a mix of triumph and sadness. He had proven himself on the court, but he knew that no matter how many times he won, Tim and the other boys would never fully accept him. Back at home, Ethan shared the story with his parents and sister. Derek was proud of his son for standing up for himself, but he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. The tension in the neighborhood wasn't just affecting him and Alyssa. It was seeping into every aspect of their children's lives. A few days later, Alyssa received an unexpected phone call from Thomas Bell, the president of the Homeowners Association. He asked to meet with her in person, saying that he had something important to discuss. Alyssa agreed, though she felt a sense of unease as she prepared for the meeting. Thomas had never been particularly friendly toward the Harris family, but he had also been careful not to show outright hostility. Alyssa wasn't sure what to expect. When she arrived at the association office, Thomas greeted her with his usual distant professionalism. They exchanged pleasantries before sitting down in the conference room. "I'll get right to the point, Mrs. Harris," Thomas said, folding his hands on the table. "Some members of the association are still concerned about the unrest that's been happening in the neighborhood." Alyssa narrowed her eyes, her frustration building. "Unrest? My family has done nothing but try to fit in here, and we've been met with threats, vandalism, and exclusion. If anyone's causing unrest, it's the people who've been harassing us." Thomas raised a hand in a gesture of calm. "I understand your frustration, but there are some who feel that your family's presence has disrupted the peace and harmony of Maplewood Grove. They're planning to file a formal complaint against you." Alyssa's jaw tightened. "On what grounds?" Thomas sighed, leaning back in his chair. "They're claiming that your presence is causing tension in the neighborhood, that your family is different, and that difference is creating conflict." Alyssa felt a surge of anger, but she kept her voice steady. "We're not going anywhere, Mr. Bell. We have every right to be here, and we're not going to let a few prejudiced neighbors push us out." "I understand," Thomas said, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but I have to advise you to keep a low profile. Sometimes things have a way of working themselves out if you don't stir the pot." Alyssa stood, her patience wearing thin. "We're not the ones stirring the pot, Mr. Bell, but we will defend ourselves if we have to." With that, she left the office, her mind racing with frustration and determination. When she returned home, Derek could see the anger etched on her face. "What happened?" he asked, setting down the work he had been doing. Alyssa recounted the conversation, her voice laced with disbelief. "They're still trying to push us out, Derek. Thomas basically told me to stay quiet and let it blow over, as if we're the problem." Derek's expression hardened. "They want us to lie down and take it. They think if they push hard enough, we'll leave." "Well, they're wrong," Alyssa said firmly. "We're not going anywhere." "We'll need to gather more evidence," Derek said, his mind already racing with plans. "If they file that complaint, we need to be ready to fight back." Over the next few days, Derek and Alyssa worked tirelessly to gather additional documentation. They compiled more photographs of vandalism, saved copies of every note they had received, and made detailed records of every hostile interaction. Derek also reached out to Nancy Parker and Margaret Johnson, asking if they would be willing to speak up on their behalf if it came to that. Meanwhile, Samantha and Ethan continued to face challenges of their own at school. While the bullying had eased somewhat, the tension remained palpable. Samantha overheard classmates repeating their parents' prejudiced comments, and Ethan's relationships with the neighborhood kids remained strained. One day, as Samantha sat at lunch with a few of her classmates, she overheard a group of students at the next table talking about her family. "They shouldn't even be here," one girl said, her voice dripping with disdain. "My dad says they're causing trouble for the whole neighborhood." Samantha's temper flared, and she turned to face the group, her voice steady but filled with anger. "We're not causing trouble. We're just trying to live our lives just like everyone else." The other kids looked taken aback by Samantha's outburst, exchanging uncomfortable glances, but one boy, Tyler Marks, who had been friendly to Samantha since she moved in, stood up for her. "She's right," Tyler said, his voice firm. "You don't even know what you're talking about. Just because your parents say something doesn't make it true." Samantha felt a wave of gratitude toward Tyler, though she knew it wouldn't change the minds of the other kids. Still, it was a small victory, and she appreciated Tyler's support. As the tension continued to simmer in the neighborhood and at school, Derek and Alyssa prepared for the next homeowners association meeting. They knew that Bill Anderson and his allies were still pushing for action against them, and they were ready to fight back with everything they had. The night of the meeting, the atmosphere in the community center was tense. Derek and Alyssa sat in the audience, surrounded by neighbors, some of whom they knew had been behind the harassment. Thomas Bell called the meeting to order, his voice carefully neutral as he addressed the room. "We've received complaints from some members of this community regarding recent disturbances," Thomas began. "We want to ensure that everyone in this neighborhood feels safe and welcome, but it seems that some feel otherwise." Derek stood up, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "I'd like to address those concerns directly." All eyes turned to him, and Derek could feel the weight of their stares. He took a deep breath and began, laying out the evidence he and Alyssa had gathered. He described the threats, vandalism, exclusion, and harassment his family had endured since moving to Maplewood Grove. He handed over the thick folder of documentation to Thomas Bell, who flipped through the pages with a growing look of concern. "These are the facts," Derek said, his voice unwavering. "My family has done nothing to disrupt this community. We've made every effort to be good neighbors. The hostility we've faced is unwarranted, and we're prepared to take legal action if necessary." The room was silent. Derek scanned the faces of the neighbors, challenging anyone to speak up against him. Bill Anderson, who had been one of the main instigators, shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. Finally, Margaret Johnson stood up, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "The Harris family has done nothing wrong," she said. "I let myself get caught up in the negativity and I regret it. They deserve to be treated with the same respect as anyone else here." Her words seemed to break the tension, and slowly others began to murmur in agreement. Thomas Bell, realizing that the tide had turned, nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Mr. Harris, for bringing this to our attention," he said. "We will review this evidence carefully and take the appropriate actions." As the meeting adjourned, Derek and Alyssa were approached by several neighbors offering apologies and assurances of support. Derek accepted their words graciously, though he knew it would take time to rebuild trust. As they left the community center that night, Derek turned to Alyssa with a sense of relief. "We did it," he said quietly. Alyssa squeezed his hand, her voice filled with hope. "We did, but there's still work to be done." Derek nodded, knowing she was right. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time since they had moved into Maplewood Grove, he felt a glimmer of hope that things might finally begin to change. As the weeks passed, the uneasy peace in Maplewood Grove persisted, but Derek and Alyssa knew it was temporary. The tension hung in the air, a silent reminder that not everyone had come around, and that some were still determined to drive the Harris family out. Bill Anderson, though quieter since the last homeowners association meeting, was still a powerful figure in the neighborhood, and Derek had no doubt that he was waiting for another opportunity to strike. Then, one evening, the final push came. The Harris family returned home from a quiet dinner out, hoping for a peaceful end to their evening. But when they pulled into the driveway, they found their front lawn littered with garbage, bags of trash torn open, rotting food, and even shards of broken glass scattered across the grass. Spray painted across their garage door in bright red letters were the words, "Get out now." Alyssa gasped, covering her mouth in shock. Samantha and Ethan, who had been sitting quietly in the back seat, stared in disbelief. "Oh my God," Samantha whispered. "Who would do this?" Ethan's wide eyes filled with fear. "Mom, Dad, are we in danger?" Derek's hands clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as anger surged through him. This wasn't just a petty act of vandalism. This was a threat, a final warning from those who still saw the Harris family as outsiders. Alyssa reached over and placed her hand on Derek's arm, her voice shaky but determined. "Derek, we need to call the police." Derek nodded, his mind racing. "We will," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "But first, let's get the kids inside." The family quickly exited the car and hurried into the house, locking the doors behind them. Derek dialed the police, reporting the vandalism and the threats they had received. As they waited for the officers to arrive, Derek paced the living room, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "They're trying to scare us," Derek said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "They want us to run, but we're not going anywhere." Alyssa sat on the couch with Samantha and Ethan, comforting the children as best she could. "We'll be okay," she reassured them, though Derek could see the worry in her eyes. "We're safe here, and we're not going to let them win." It wasn't long before the police arrived, taking photographs of the vandalism and writing up a report. But Derek knew that nothing would come of it. The police had been called before, and each time they had done little more than make note of the harassment. The real power to end this fight lay with the homeowners association and the neighbors themselves. After the officers left, Derek and Alyssa gathered the family around the dining table. "We're not going to let them push us out," Derek said, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "They want us to feel afraid, but we belong here just as much as anyone else. We've worked hard for everything we have, and we're not going to let them take it from us." Samantha and Ethan nodded, though the fear in their eyes hadn't entirely faded. "We're going to fight back," Alyssa added, her tone firm. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about standing up for what's right. No one should have to live in fear just because some people don't like who they are." As the family sat together, they discussed their next steps. Derek knew that the time had come for a final confrontation with the homeowners association. They had tried to resolve things peacefully, but the vandalism and threats had crossed a line. Now, It was time to fight back in a way that would make it clear that the Harris family wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Derek called an emergency meeting with Thomas Bell, the president of the Homeowners Association. He also reached out to Nancy Parker and Margaret Johnson, hoping to rally their support for what was sure to be a contentious meeting. When Derek arrived at the community center later that week, the tension in the air was palpable. The usual calm of the neighborhood was gone, replaced by a simmering unease that Derek could feel as soon as he walked in. Bill Anderson was already there, sitting with his usual group of allies, his expression cold and defiant. Thomas Bell called the meeting to order, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining neutrality. "We've called this meeting to discuss the recent events in our neighborhood," he began, glancing nervously at Derek. "It's clear that tensions have been running high and we need to find a way to restore peace." Derek stood up, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "I'd like to address those tensions directly." All eyes turned to him, the weight of the room's attention heavy on his shoulders. Derek could see the faces of the neighbors, some curious, others hostile, and a few sympathetic. He knew that what he was about to say would determine the future of his family in this community. "My family moved to Maplewood Grove because we believed it was a place where we could build a life, where our children could grow up feeling safe and accepted," Derek began, his voice clear and firm. "But since we've moved here, we've been met with hostility, threats, and acts of vandalism. Our property has been defaced, and my family has been made to feel like outsiders in the very place we call home." There were murmurs of discomfort from around the room, but Derek pressed on, his resolve unshaken. "This isn't just about my family," Derek continued. "It's about what kind of community Maplewood Grove wants to be. Are we a place that welcomes diversity, that values fairness and decency, or are we a place that lets prejudice and fear dictate who belongs and who doesn't?" Bill Anderson, who had been sitting quietly up until this point, stood up, his face flushed with anger. "This isn't about prejudice," Bill snapped, his voice rising. "It's about keeping the integrity of this neighborhood. We've built something special here, and we're not going to let outsiders come in and change everything." Derek turned to face Bill, his expression calm but unyielding. "What exactly are we changing, Bill? We've done nothing but try to fit in. We've respected the rules, attended the meetings, paid our dues. The only thing we've asked for is to be treated with the same respect as everyone else." Bill sneered, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? It's not about the rules, it's about the way things are done around here. Some people just don't fit in." Derek took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto Bill's. "You're right, Bill. Some people don't fit in. People who think it's okay to intimidate others, to deface property and threaten families. People who believe that a community is only for those who look or act in a certain way. But that's not the kind of neighborhood Maplewood Grove is supposed to be." The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Derek could see the conflict on the faces of his neighbors, some nodding in agreement, others frowning in disapproval. Bill's allies looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as Derek's words hit home. Margaret Johnson stood up, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "I was wrong," she said quietly, glancing at Derek. "I let myself get caught up in the fear and the negativity. But the Harris family deserves to be here, and we need to make things right." Nancy Parker nodded in agreement, standing up next to Margaret. "This isn't who we are," she said, addressing the room. "We're better than this. We can't let a few people ruin the sense of community we've worked so hard to build." There were murmurs of agreement from around the room, and Derek could feel the tide beginning to turn. But Bill Anderson wasn't ready to back down. "This changes nothing," Bill shouted, his voice filled with frustration. "We have a right to protect our neighborhood. Just because you own property here doesn't mean you belong here." Derek met Bill's gaze steadily, his voice calm but filled with authority. "I'm not asking for special treatment, Bill. I'm asking for fairness, for decency. If you can't offer that, then maybe it's you who needs to reconsider where you live." The room was electric with tension, and for a moment it seemed as though things might spiral out of control. But then Thomas Bell, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stood up. Enough, Thomas said, his voice firm but controlled. We've heard both sides, and it's clear that this neighborhood is at a crossroads. We can either continue down this path of division or we can come together and move forward as a community. Thomas glanced around the room, his gaze resting briefly on Bill before turning to Derek. I, for one, believe that the Harris family belongs in Maplewood Grove. They've shown resilience, respect, and a commitment to this community. And it's time we show them the same in return. Derek felt a wave of relief wash over him as he heard Thomas's words. He could see the faces of the neighbors softening, their resistance beginning to crumble. Bill Anderson, however, wasn't ready to give up. He stood up one last time, his face a mask of anger. "This isn't over," he muttered before storming out of the room, his allies following behind him. As the door slammed shut behind Bill, Derek felt the tension in the room finally begin to ease. Thomas Bell turned to Derek, extending a hand in a gesture of solidarity. "Thank you, Mr. Harris," Thomas said, his voice sincere. "You've shown remarkable strength in the face of adversity. We're lucky to have you as part of this community." Derek shook his hand, a sense of cautious optimism filling him. "Thank you, Mr. Bell. We're here to stay, and we want to work together to make this neighborhood better for everyone." As the meeting came to an end, Derek and Alyssa were approached by several neighbors offering apologies and gestures of friendship. Nancy and Margaret promised to stand by them in the future, and even some of Bill's former allies expressed a willingness to move forward. For the first time in months, Derek felt a glimmer of hope. The battle wasn't over, but they had taken a significant step toward reclaiming their place in Maplewood Grove. As Derek and Alyssa walked home that evening, hand in hand, they knew that the road ahead would still have challenges, but they were ready to face them together as a family, and they were no longer alone. "We did it," Alyssa said softly, her voice filled with pride. Derek smiled, pulling her closer. "Yeah, we did. But this is just the beginning." The next day, Derek and Alyssa woke to a neighborhood that felt different. The garbage was cleaned up, the hateful message on their garage door was painted over, and for the first time in a long while, they felt like they could breathe. The fight had been long and hard, but they had stood their ground. And slowly but surely, Maplewood Grove was beginning to change. The morning after the climactic meeting at the community center, Maplewood Grove felt different. There was still a lingering tension in the air, but it no longer felt like an invisible wall standing between the Harris family and the rest of the neighborhood. Derek, Alyssa, Samantha, and Ethan could sense the shift. It wasn't complete acceptance, but it was the beginning of something new, something better. Derek woke early as usual and stepped outside to retrieve the morning paper. He paused at the threshold of the house, half expecting another act of vandalism, another message telling them they didn't belong. But this time, there was nothing. The lawn was clean, the hateful graffiti had been washed away, and there was a peaceful stillness in the air. The streets of Maplewood Grove, bathed in the soft glow of morning light, looked almost welcoming again. "Nothing new this morning," Derek said to Alyssa as he walked back inside. "It's quiet out there." Alyssa smiled, though her expression remained cautious. "Quiet is good. Let's hope it stays that way." The children soon joined their parents for breakfast, and Derek could sense a lightness in the atmosphere that hadn't been there in months. Samantha and Ethan were smiling, chatting about their plans for the day, and there was no talk of the hostility they had faced at school. Maybe the tides had really turned. "I think things are starting to change," Samantha said, her tone hesitant but hopeful. "Yesterday, a couple of kids who wouldn't even look at me before actually smiled at me in the hallway." "That's great, Sam," Alyssa said, her eyes lighting up. "It'll take time, but I think people are starting to see that we're not going anywhere." Ethan chimed in, nodding eagerly. "And guess what? Tim, one of the kids who wouldn't play with me, he waved at me after school. He didn't say anything, but it's a start, right?" Derek grinned, ruffling Ethan's hair. "That's definitely a start." Despite these small but significant victories, Derek and Alyssa knew the battle wasn't over. The neighborhood had begun to shift in their favor, but there were still those who harbored resentment. those who believed the Harris family didn't belong in Maplewood Grove. And then there was Bill Anderson, who had stormed out of the last homeowners association meeting in anger. Derek hadn't seen or heard from Bill since that night, but he had no doubt that Bill wasn't done fighting. Later that week, Alyssa received an unexpected invitation from Nancy Parker. Nancy, who had been one of the first to extend a hand of friendship after the homeowners association meeting, had invited Alyssa to join her for lunch. It was a gesture that felt genuine, and Alyssa, always willing to give people a chance, accepted. As Alyssa walked to the small cafe where they had agreed to meet, she reflected on how much things had changed since they first moved to Maplewood Grove. The cold, unfriendly stares had been replaced by polite nods, and though not everyone had come around, there was a sense that the neighborhood was beginning to open its doors, even if just a little. Nancy was waiting for Alyssa when she arrived with a warm smile on her face. The two women exchanged greetings and settled into a cozy corner of the cafe. "I'm really glad you came," Nancy said, sipping her coffee. "I wanted to apologize again for the way things started between us. I let myself get caught up in the fear, and I'm not proud of it." Alyssa nodded, appreciating Nancy's honesty. "It's not easy to admit when we've been wrong, Nancy, but I think a lot of people in the neighborhood were scared of change. It's human nature to resist what we don't understand." Nancy sighed, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "That's exactly what it was, fear. But I've realized that Maplewood Grove is better when we embrace everyone who calls it home, and I'm sorry it took so long for some of us to see that." Alyssa smiled, feeling a sense of relief that she hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you for saying that, Nancy. It means a lot to us." The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they discussed their families, shared stories about their children, and even laughed about some of the more ridiculous moments that had happened during neighborhood meetings. For the first time since they moved to Maplewood Grove, Alyssa felt like she was part of something. A friendship, a connection that went beyond the superficial barriers that had once kept them apart. Meanwhile, Derek was facing a different challenge. Despite the progress they had made, he knew that Bill Anderson was still a problem that needed to be addressed. Bill's influence over certain parts of the neighborhood was undeniable, and even though his vocal opposition to the Harris family had quieted since the homeowners association meeting, Derek wasn't naive enough to think that Bill had changed his mind. One afternoon, as Derek was working in his home office, he received a knock on the door. When he opened it, he was surprised to find Bill Anderson standing on his porch. Derek's first instinct was to brace himself for another confrontation, but Bill's demeanor was different. He wasn't angry or defiant, he looked tired. "Mr. Anderson," Derek said, keeping his tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" Bill shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact at first. "I came to apologize." Derek raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by Bill's unexpected words. "I've lived in this neighborhood for a long time," Bill continued, his voice quieter than Derek had ever heard it. "And I've always believed that I was protecting something, keeping things the way they were supposed to be. But I've come to realize that maybe I've been wrong." Derek crossed his arms, studying Bill carefully. "Go on." Bill finally met Derek's gaze, his expression filled with something that almost resembled remorse. "I let my fears and prejudices get the better of me. I made things difficult for you and your family because I didn't want to admit that things were changing. I didn't want to admit that I was the one who needed to change." Derek was silent for a moment, considering Bill's words. He had spent months dealing with the man's hostility, and now here he was, standing on Derek's porch, asking for forgiveness. It wasn't an easy thing to accept. "Mr. Anderson," Derek said slowly, his voice calm but firm, "it takes a lot to admit when we've been wrong. I appreciate your apology, but trust isn't something that's rebuilt overnight. It's going to take time." Bill nodded, looking down at the ground. "I understand that, and I know it'll take time to make things right, but I'm willing to try." Derek extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation, Bill shook it. "We'll take it one step at a time," Derek said, "but I'm not going anywhere, and neither is my family." Bill nodded again, and without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Derek standing on the porch, feeling a mix of surprise and cautious optimism. The following weeks brought more signs of reconciliation. Nancy Parker invited Alyssa to join the neighborhood book club, and though Alyssa was hesitant at first, she eventually accepted the invitation. To her surprise, the other women in the group, who had once been distant and unwelcoming, were warm and friendly. They shared book recommendations, swapped recipes, and slowly but surely, Alyssa felt herself becoming part of the fabric of the neighborhood. Samantha and Ethan also noticed changes at school. While not everyone had come around, the bullying had stopped, and a few of their classmates, including Tyler Marks, had made efforts to include them in activities. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Derek reflected on how far they had come since moving to Maplewood Grove. "Things are really starting to change," Derek said, smiling at Alyssa. "The neighborhood feels different. Better." Alyssa nodded, her eyes bright with hope. "I think so too. It's not perfect, but it's a start." Samantha, who had been quiet for most of the meal, looked up and grinned. "Guess what? I got invited to a party this weekend. One of the girls at school, Megan, she's having a birthday party and she actually invited me." "That's amazing, Sam," Alyssa said, beaming with pride. "You deserve to be included." Ethan chimed in with his own news. "And I made a new friend. His name's Lucas, and we played basketball after school. He's really cool." Derek couldn't help but smile at his children's stories. They had fought so hard to find their place in this community, and now it felt like they were finally being accepted. Despite the progress, Derek and Alyssa knew that not everyone in the neighborhood had come around. There were still those who harbored resentment, who believed that the Harris family didn't belong in Maplewood Grove. But for the first time in months, the Harris family didn't feel like they were alone. The annual block party was fast approaching, and this year, for the first time, the Harris family received a personal invitation. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything to Derek and Alyssa. They had been excluded from so many events in the past, but now they are welcomed, even if it was just a cautious step. As the day of the block party arrived, the Harris family prepared with a sense of excitement and nervousness. They had made it through the worst of hostility, but this was their first real test of whether the neighborhood had truly begun to change. When they arrived at the park where the block party was being held, they were greeted with polite smiles and nods from the neighbors. The cold hostility that had once greeted them at every turn was gone, replaced by an uneasy but growing acceptance. Derek and Alyssa mingled with the other families, making small talk and sharing food. Samantha and Ethan quickly joined the other kids playing games on the lawn, their laughter ringing out in the warm evening air. It was a sight that filled Derek's heart with pride. His children finally at peace in a place that had once seemed so hostile. As the night wore on, Derek found himself standing with Nancy Parker and a few other neighbors, watching the children play. The conversation was easy, filled with laughter and camaraderie, and for the first time, Derek felt like he truly belonged to Maplewood Grove. "This is what a neighborhood should be," Nancy said, smiling as she watched the kids run across the grass. "A place where everyone feels welcome." Derek nodded, his heart full. "It's taken a lot to get here, but I think we're finally on the right track." That night, as the Harris family returned home, they sat together in the living room, reflecting on the evening. For the first time in months, there was no tension, no fear of what might happen next. They had weathered the storm, and though there were still challenges ahead, they knew they had the strength to face them together. "We did it," Alyssa said softly, leaning her head on Derek's shoulder. Derek smiled, wrapping his arm around her. "We did, and it's only going to get better from here." Samantha and Ethan, exhausted from the day's excitement, snuggled up beside their parents, content and happy. For the first time in a long while, the Harris family felt a sense of peace. They had faced adversity head-on, stood up for themselves, and emerged stronger. Maplewood Grove might still have its challenges, but the Harris family knew that they had earned their place in this community. And with each passing day, they were slowly but surely turning their block into a true neighborhood, one where everyone, regardless of their background, could feel at home. As the weeks turned into months, the Harris family continued to settle into their new life in Maplewood Grove. The hostility they had faced seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a growing sense of acceptance from their neighbors. While there were still some in the community who kept their distance, the overt acts of exclusion and harassment had ceased. In their place were nods of acknowledgement, polite conversations, and even the occasional wave from neighbors who had once been indifferent or hostile. One Saturday morning, as Derek was mowing the lawn, he noticed Bill Anderson walking his dog on the sidewalk across the street. For a brief moment, Derek expected Bill to ignore him, as he had so many times before. But to his surprise, Bill raised a hand in a hesitant wave. Derek nodded in return, feeling a small sense of satisfaction. The gesture was a far cry from the angry confrontation they had faced months ago, but it was a sign that things were changing. Inside the house, Alyssa was preparing breakfast when her phone buzzed with a message from Nancy Parker. It was a group text inviting her and a few other neighbors to a casual get-together at Nancy's house later that afternoon. Alyssa smiled as she read the message. It was a simple invitation, but it represented so much more. It was a sign that she was no longer an outsider in the neighborhood. "Looks like Nancy's hosting a little gathering later," Alyssa said to Derek as he came in from the yard, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "She invited us to come over." Derek raised an eyebrow, impressed. "That's great. Sounds like we're finally being included in everything." Alyssa nodded, her smile warm. "It feels good. I think we should go." "Absolutely," Derek agreed. "It'll be nice to spend time with everyone in a more relaxed setting." The children were equally excited about the invitation. Samantha had continued to build friendships at school, and Megan, the girl who had invited her to the birthday party, had become one of her closest friends. Ethan had also found his place among the other kids, playing basketball with Lucas and even joining a local youth basketball league. That afternoon, as the family walked over to Nancy Parker's house, they couldn't help but marvel at how different things felt compared to when they first arrived in Maplewood Grove. The fear and uncertainty that had once weighed them down had lifted, replaced by a sense of belonging. Nancy's backyard was filled with neighbors, chatting and laughing as they enjoyed the sunny afternoon. A long table was set up with snacks and drinks, and children ran around playing games in the yard. As soon as they arrived, Nancy greeted the Harris family with a warm smile. "I'm so glad you could make it," Nancy said, hugging Alyssa and shaking Derek's hand. "It's nice to finally have everyone together like this." "It's great to be here," Derek replied, genuinely appreciating the invitation. As they mingled with the other neighbors, Derek and Alyssa noticed how much had changed. Conversations flowed easily, and there were no longer awkward pauses or sideways glances that had characterized their earlier interactions with the community. People were genuinely interested in getting to know them, and the tension that had once defined their presence in Maplewood Grove seemed to have evaporated. Margaret Johnson approached Alyssa with a cup of lemonade, her expression sincere. "I wanted to thank you again, Alyssa, for being so understanding. I know it wasn't easy when things started off so rocky, but I'm really glad we've moved past all that." Alyssa smiled, grateful for Margaret's continued efforts to make amends. "It wasn't easy, but we're in a much better place now, and we're happy to be part of this community." Margaret nodded, taking a sip of her drink. "We're happy to have you here." Across the yard, Derek found himself in conversation with Thomas Bell, the president of the Homeowners Association, who had played a key role in helping to quell the conflict in the neighborhood. "Derek," Thomas said, looking out over the yard where the neighbors were gathered, "I think we've all learned something important through this whole experience. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary if we want our community to grow stronger." Derek nodded in agreement. "You're right. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And I think Maplewood Grove is a better place for it now." Thomas smiled, clapping Derek on the back. "You and your family have brought something special to this neighborhood. I'm glad you didn't give up on us." Derek chuckled. "Trust me, it was tempting at times, but we weren't going to let a few bad apples push us out." Thomas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Well, we're better off because you stayed." and I think we've all come out of this stronger." As the sun began to set, the block party started winding down. The Harris family lingered a little longer, enjoying the company of their neighbors and the feeling of being part of the community. For the first time since they had moved to Maplewood Grove, they felt at peace. When they finally returned home, Samantha and Ethan were full of stories from the party, who they had played with, what games they had won, and all the new friendships they were building. Alyssa and Derek listened with pride, knowing that their children had found their place in a neighborhood that had once felt so hostile. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Derek and Alyssa sat together on the back porch, watching the stars twinkle above. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the heat of the day, and the stillness of the neighborhood felt comforting rather than oppressive. "We made it," Alyssa said softly, leaning her head on Derek's shoulder. Derek smiled, wrapping his arm around her. "We did," Alyssa sighed contentedly, gazing out at the quiet street. "I never thought we'd get here. There were so many times when I wondered if it was worth it, if we should just leave and find somewhere else. But now, it feels like we really belong." Derek nodded, his voice thoughtful. "It took time and it wasn't easy. But we stood on our ground, and I think we've changed this place for the better." Alyssa smiled, her heart full of gratitude. "I think so too, and I'm proud of us for not giving up." Derek kissed the top of her head, feeling a deep sense of peace. "I'm proud of us too. We fought for what was right, and we made this place our home." They sat in silence for a while longer, enjoying the calm of the evening and the knowledge that they had finally found their place in Maplewood Grove. It hadn't been easy, but they had faced every challenge with courage, determination, and love, and in the end, they built something truly special. A home, a community, and a future filled with hope. 6 months after the Harris family had moved to Maplewood Grove, the neighborhood was almost unrecognizable from the place it had once been. The hostility and division that had defined the early days of their arrival had been replaced by a growing sense of unity. The block that had once seemed so cold and unwelcoming was now a true community, one where people of different backgrounds, races, and perspectives lived together in harmony. The annual Maplewood Grove charity event, once a small and insular affair, had grown into a major neighborhood tradition. This year, Derek and Alyssa had been invited to join the planning committee, a gesture that symbolized just how far they had come. They worked alongside Nancy Parker, Margaret Johnson, and even Bill Anderson, who, while still reserved, had made efforts to reconcile with the Harris family. The event was a resounding success. Held in the park at the center of the neighborhood, it featured food stalls, games for the kids, live music, and a raffle that raised money for a local charity. The entire community had come together to contribute, and the atmosphere was one of joy and celebration. As Derek stood in the park, watching Samantha and Ethan laugh and play with their friends, he felt a deep sense of pride. This was the community they had fought for, the future they had worked so hard to build. Nancy Parker approached Derek, smiling as she handed him a glass of lemonade. "This turned out even better than I imagined," she said, looking around at the bustling event. "And I think a lot of that is thanks to you and your family." Derek shook his head modestly. "We just wanted to help make this a place where everyone feels welcome. It's the people who've come together to make that happen." Nancy smiled, her eyes warm with appreciation. "Well, you've been a big part of that. And I'm really glad you're here, Derek." Derek smiled in return, feeling a sense of fulfillment that went beyond words. "Thank you, Nancy. I'm glad we're here too." As the event wound down, Derek and Alyssa found themselves surrounded by neighbors, people who had once been strangers or even adversaries, but who now felt like friends. They had come to this neighborhood seeking a fresh start, and through all the challenges, they had found something even more meaningful: a true community. That evening, as they walked home under the stars, Derek and Alyssa held hands, their hearts full. The road had been long and difficult, but they had faced it together. And now, standing on the other side of it, they knew that their place in Maplewood Grove was secure. "I never thought we'd get here," Alyssa said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "But now, it feels like this is where we were always meant to be." Derek smiled, pulling her close. I know, and I think we've made this place better, not just for us, but for everyone. They stood in front of their house for a moment, looking at the home they had fought so hard to protect. The words that had once been spray-painted across their garage door were long gone, replaced by a fresh coat of paint and a sense of peace that filled every corner of their lives. We're home, Alyssa said, her voice barely above a whisper. Derek nodded, his heart swelling with love for his family and gratitude for the journey they had taken together. He said softly, We're home, and with that, the Harris family stepped inside, closing the door to the past and opening a new chapter in life. They had built a life filled with hope, resilience, and knowledge that no matter what challenges they might face in the future, they had the strength to overcome them together. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, be sure to subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll never miss out on our latest videos, stories, and content that inspire and uplift. Don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay updated whenever we post new content. Thank you for being part of our journey. We can't wait to share more stories with you.